Hi, years 12 and 13. Today I'm giving you another rundown on your Gothic essays. So for year 13, this is coming after the mock, where a lot of you missed out on some of your core assessment objectives, and that's why you got a grade you didn't entirely like, though again, all of them were great. And for year 12, this is really your introduction to Gothic essays, how to write them and how to write a good one. Okay, so it's all about argumentation, analysis, but also context. The little asterisk there is telling us that most of this applies to your Ibsen Rossetti essays too. They've all got exactly the same assessment objectives. Now, fundamentally, the exam board and all your teachers will tell you it's a literary essay. Your main job is to compare your two authors, except that the way the exam boards arrange the weight of assessment, they're putting almost all of your context marks into these essays. So technically, 50% of your mark is for embedding your argumentation within context. For Ibsen Rossetti, that's some literary context, but very much historical cultural context, which makes sense with those two texts and the shift from The Angel in the House to The New Woman of the latter part of the century. You can see everything happening there with those two texts. For your Gothic essays, it's a bit different. You'll have spent 2 years becoming an expert in your genre, in the Gothic genre, and learning a wide range of texts from the genre, doing your own reading, bringing your own thoughts into it, and fundamentally swaggering about having your own opinion on what the Gothic is. And that idea of making big statements about the Gothic that I talked about with year 12 today, and that year 13 and I have been discussing all the way since autumn half term, is summed up in the style of question. You have a range of questions to answer. They're all steered slightly differently. They all mention different authors. But the deal with OCR is that you have to study either Dracula or The Bloody Chamber or both. And so therefore, all the questions mention either Dracula or The Bloody Chamber. Because we choose to do those two texts, you can answer the full range of questions. See, that's how clever we are. So your questions always look like a quotation from a critic. The indispensable feature of nearly any Gothic narrative is a haunted space that reflects or corresponds to a haunted mind. And then the red part there is a steer that directs it either into a more generic theme. So it might say, in light of this statement, to what extent do you agree that haunted spaces are a core feature of Dracula? Or it might say something much more specific, which is the one I've given you to plan. To what extent do you agree that haunted spaces are a reflection of the mind in Dracula and one other novel you studied? But it really, 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 really means not just those two novels. AO3, again, is 50% of your mark. You have to be, as I've said here, an informed, analytic, and persuasive Gothicist. At this point, you're a specialist. Year 12, you're quite specialist already. Year 13, you're even more so specialist. So the year 13 mock that they did back in December began like this. The steer was, in Gothic writing, female characters are generally presented as victims. And then the bit coming back to you, statement, then steer, by comparing The Bloody Chamber and other stories with at least one other text prescribed for this topic, discuss how far you agree with this view. One easy way you can wrong is by not spending enough time on the second text. So like at least one or two of your mocks, you really focus much more on The Bloody Chamber. And again, year 12, that might be an easy trap to fall into because it's named one author. You think the focus is supposed to be there. It's always those two texts, but it is largely about the Gothic, right? Which is where my year 13s went wrong. And what we're doing in both classes, trying to make sure we don't go wrong with that again. So we're going to look a little bit at Laura Jane's essay, because we can see from that how marking happens in these things, how we construct arguments, and what techniques we can use to keep pulling in that AO3, making sure that we're contextualizing in a detailed and specific way. But before that, we're going to look very quickly at what I've said here, the set of OCR assessed candidate answers for this paper. The paper we gave year 13 was an old paper. We have a full range of exemplar material of people who'd answered getting across the range. So people who went from band 6, which is A star, down to below C. Right, so let's look at the introduction to this one. Now this person got 23 marks, so that's a B, right? Quite a low B, but still a very solid B. In Gothic writing, female characters are generally presented as victims. Now, this person does exactly what I was telling you about swaggering around, having an opinion on the Gothic, sounding like a Gothic expert. Gothic writing emerged in the 18th century into a general social climate of uncertainty, contrasting to its common literary predecessor of Romantic writing. Well, that's wrong. We're like, but it sounds confident and it's trying to make large historical claims. So, not getting things wrong is quite an important part, right? It was used as a method of exploration of human concerns and debates. Consequently, a common theme was that of women's role in society. The idea was readily explored alongside other issues, such as the conflicts of religion and science. Gothic writing was used as an outlet to explore fears. As such, Carter did so from her own feminist point of view, and Stoker places importance on the roles of Mina and Lucy to delve into the rise of the new woman. Now, if I'm marking that, I've noticed that you've contextualized it, you're swaggering it, you've got a theory on the Gothic, but that one's not quite working for me. It's got some historical information wrong, and it actually hasn't finished coming up with its main idea. What I think this really rather wonderful candidate is saying is that one of the core features and anxieties of the Gothic writing is always femininity and anxiety surrounding the female body. Carter approaches that from a second wave feminism perspective, where the anxieties around female agency and emerging feminism and body control, anxiety surrounding pornography and female sexuality. Bram Stoker, on the other hand, is writing from a context of anxiety surrounding the new woman, right? So that's a fairly straightforward comparison. If you wanted to get it premium tip top, you'd have swaggered about the Gothic and the history of the female body as a site of anxiety in a more specific way. So you could have talked about the emergence of the Gothic as a powerhouse, hugely best-selling genre in the 1790s as a response to specific proto-feminism coming along there, where you have Ellen Moers's theory of the female Gothic, which posits the 1790s as a decade in which women authors use images of entrapment and Gothic edifices to explore sensations of being trapped in domesticity. That's her argument for Radcliffe, the female Gothic. Or you can mention Wollstonecraft and the emergence of the first kind of voice calling very explicitly for women's rights, right? So again, making big statements. Excellent question today from year 12. Why are we looking at the American Gothic if we're writing about Dracula and Carter? Because you need to have a broad, personal, deeply informed opinion about the Gothic, right? Just chatting about it is actually the best way forward. So let's go back to our Gothic essays. And then let's look at Laura Jane specifically. So I'm going to forgive me while I flap around, changing what I'm sharing. Okay, it's having problems with that one. So we'll go back to the presentation again and read it from there. I'll have to blow it up. Oh, the wonders of doing these things from a computer. Okay, welcome back to the Google slide presentation. Right, so let's see if we can blow this one up a bit. The position of the female body is one that is central to the Gothic genre and can be traditionally depicted by Anne Radcliffe's The Italian, full of swooning, helpless female victims. Divided by Mulvey's male gaze into arguably a duality of female sexuality, Angela Carter explores this duality and the transgression between passive and predator. Bram Stoker's Dracula uses the latter as an embodiment of the late Victorian societal fears of sexuality and the proposition of the female having a status of power. Now, the one thing that is slightly wrong with Laura Jane's essay is she's not quite swaggered enough there, right? She's not made broad enough statements about the Gothic, but generally speaking, she's honed in much more closely on the issues of gender and how that informs the Gothic in a really very admirable way. As I'm going to discuss on the next page, you'll see what I've written down the side is not comments so much as merely notations of where you hit the assessment objectives. And that is how your examiners will mark, right? They read through, they've got a set of computer-generated inputs to use, and it says 5, 4, 3, 1, right? Not 2. Just are you hitting the assessment objectives? And then when I flip back through the pages, I can see, yeah, Laura Dane's got tons of AO5. She's got some lovely AO4, which is comparison. She's got AO3. She's got AO3. And what I'm really looking for is AO3, AO3, AO3. Are you building in those detailed and richly relevant contextual things? Do you do it through the whole of the essay? And therefore, is it sophisticated, sustained, and excellent? Right? Those are our kind of keywords for the top band. I know you all want to get AA stars. I want to give you all AA stars. So let's approach it that way. So first paragraph. The Marquis de Sades, 1791, Justine and Juliet, shows quite literally the dual side to female sexuality and is evoked by Angela Carter's The Snow Child in an allusion to Justine, a naive and innocent girl who finds herself at the peril of the male gaze. The Snow Child is described as having white skin, red lips, black hair, a physical representation of the Count's desiring male gaze. Now, just pausing there, you'll notice that I've put AO3 at the beginning for Marquis de Sade, AO3 down at the middle, but I've actually missed out on putting an AO5. She's referencing Laura Mulvey. That's a specific way of looking at it. And in terms of doing a really excellent evocation of your knowledge of the text, detailed and specific reference to the text, she's got quotations. Right, there's no points for language analysis in your Gothic essay or in your Ibsen and Rossetti essay, but putting in detailed reference to the text, either in specific reference to moments in the text and some quotations, single word quotations, tiny little quotations, is really what you need to get to the top band. This position of vulnerability is evoked through her paleness. Within the novels, like in Matthew Lewis's The Monk, paleness and white skin is used to represent innocence and vulnerability. So there you go, one of our core texts in the Gothic canon. She's thrown in a reference to. It's a vivid and specific and sophisticated reference that shows that she, like all the rest of you, have been studying the history of the Gothic, but she, not necessarily like all the rest of you, has remembered to show that, right? The appearance of the child as stark naked, another quotation, presents a weakness that goes beyond the titillations of pornography, an allusion to the idea that passive, vulnerable woman will find herself victimized. The infantilization of the snow child in the eyes of the something male gaze is a trope found central in the Gothic, moving back out to making large comments about the Gothic, and mirrored by Bram Stoker's character of Lucy within Dracula. That's our AO4 turn between texts. So again, I'm not going to read this whole thing. You can blow up these images and look at it yourself if you want. But you can see that down the side, I'm looking for argumentation and analysis. But in order to get you to the top level, I'm looking for AO3, right? And I'll give you almost anything for AO3. I'll give it an AO3 unless it just says the Gothic archetype of the damsel in distress is at play here. That's not good enough. Every time you say the Gothic archetype of, you have to throw in a reference. And they have to be not Dracula or the Bloody Chamber. So some of year 13 remembered that they needed to be doing that, but they would reference the trope and then reference its appearances in Dracula or the Bloody Chamber. That's great. It's a good form of analysis, but you absolutely need other ones. So don't tell me the Gothic edifice of Dracula's castle. Say the Gothic edifice, like Dracula's castle, is a Gothic edifice like Rochester's Thornfield or the House of Usher or the home of Armand Aubigné in Kate Chopin's Désirée's Baby. It both externalizes and represents hidden family secrets, an uncontrollable male sexuality, and the desiring id or something. You don't have to stop and analyze those other texts. There's no room to do that in an essay of this length, but you need to show detailed knowledge. And not just because it's exam technique, because it's really fun, right? It's really interesting how these tropes have evolved. Again, see, AO3, AO5, AO3, AO3. She's hitting all the marks. And that, for the top band, and this is true in Rossetti and Ibsen, just as much as it's true in the Gothic, it means consistent, so it has to be throughout the paper. Well chosen, so they have to be relevant. Illuminating, so they have to help your analysis. Detailed and specific cultural reference. I like to use the word granular for no good reason, really, but you want granular, chunky references that make sense. So with Rossetti, it's not enough to say, well, it's like band 5 to say she worked with former prostitutes. That's true. Well done. If you say she worked with fallen prostitutes at the Highgate home, the Highgate Magdalen home for fallen women, you're consistently hitting that top level, right? Because it's detailed and specific, which seems like a bit of a trick, but actually you're really showing your richly informed position on this. The AO5 there, I'm going to come to next. AO5 is a bit pesky. The exam board lies to your teachers and to you. It says that AO5 is just a range of interpretations, and that, say, Maria in year 13's interpretation or Cushy's interpretation in year 12, any of your interpretations, any of your different classroom discussions are AO5, right? They're a range of interpretations. We all have slightly different takes on things. All those discussions we had about Desiree's baby over the last couple of days, that's AO5, different people's interpretations. They say that, but they don't reward that, right? So yes, you need to have that, but at the same time, you really do need specific reference to particular interpretations or critics, or you will not hit the top level. Does that mean you need to waste a lot of time memorizing things about the Gothic? No, not at all. With Ibsen and Rossetti, it might be a reference to Max Beerbohm's comment that the new woman sprang fully formed from Ibsen's head. With the Gothic, it could be, as you'll see when year 12, when you do it, or year 13, a lot of you did do this in your essays, a reference to Angela Carter's reading, not Angela Carter, Margaret Atwood's reading of Carter, where she breaks it down into predator or prey, lamb and lion. But also things like reference to Laura Marvey's theory of the male gaze, Chris Staver's theory of body horror and abjection. What else have we done? Freud. Any Freudian interpretation is a distinct interpretation with specific reference. So it's really an informed interpretive perspective, right? This one hit 4 marks. Again, do blow it up by all means. For both years 12 and year 13, why I'm showing you this and why you've got all those examples is because it's really showing you how to embed the knowledge that you already have. All of you have this knowledge. All of you have been studying the same body of text. Some of you have done an enormous amount of reading on your own already. In both classes, there's people who've independently read The Awakening by Kate Chopin or Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. Bring it in, right? You don't need to have I've studied this at A-level amount of knowledge. You just need to classify it as a trope. Like Heathcliff and Wuthering Heights, it's absolutely one in a long line of post-Lord Ruthven Polidori vampires, right? He's the tall, dark, and handsome Byronic hero who's anti-hero and yet sexually magnetic. We see him again and again and again. You'll have found him in other texts. You'll have found him in other TV shows and films. Put him in, right? But just make sure that when you reference a Gothic trope, haunted house, hidden backstory, metamorphosis, twins, doppelgangers, you give a reference. Yes? Right, I think that's pretty straightforward. For year 12s, I've set you a Gothic essay to plan that I'll give you a sort of tentative mark on, depending on how much it's hitting all the different assessment objectives. And for year 13, you're going to be doing that in the lesson. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much, guys. I hope that was helpful. Do write and ask me any more questions if this has not answered all the ones you already have. Thank you.